Today we are going to make a TRS cable, or a stereo cable. We're going to use a square plug on one end and a short body straight on the other. These are used for expression pedals, even guitar pedals, depending on the connections, and a whole bunch of other things on your pedal board. Very handy cable to have around and to know how to make. First thing we are going to do is actually prep our plug. There's 3 connections we need to make: the tip, the ring, and the sleeve. And we're just going to put a little bit of solder on our sleeve connection first, and this will help later down the track when we are going to attach the cable. I should also mention at the outset, my hands are big and they get in the way. Apologies for my awkwardness. So next thing we're going to do is measure the cable and where we need to trim that jacket. We want that strain relief you see on the plug itself to wrap around that black jacket. So you want to trim in front of the strain relief on the plug. The next thing we're going to do is get this ground out of the way, making sure not to miss any individual strands of that shield, which could short out your cable if you miss one. And then you want that red cable. This is just how we do it. We want the red to line up with ring. It's easy to remember, red ring, and that white center conductor to end up with the tip tab. And so you want your ground to point in the right direction to reflect that. So with red on the right and the white cable on the left, the ground should point straight down towards that solder tab we just tinned a second ago. Twisting that ground together, again making sure not to miss any individual strands. And now you can use either a cable stripper or a knife to score that insulator and get your fingernail in there if you're using a knife and give it a little twist. You can also bend the cable if you want to exaggerate your score, and you want to do the same now with that white insulator. Bend it a bit if you need to, and then after that you can get your fingernail in there, dig it in, and give it a little bit of a twist and a pull. You don't want to pull too hard, especially on shorter cables, as you might pull that whole conductor out of the cable. Not as common with this cable type on longer cables though, a bit harder to do. I've slightly bent these center conductors out to the edge. I'm now going to put a little bit of flux, give them a tin. You don't need to use flux, I just like it. It smells good, makes me feel good, but don't breathe it in. Little bit of solder and you are good to go. The next thing, this is a little bit of a trickier one, but you basically want to line these up with the solder tabs, the appropriate solder tabs, and get them in their holes as well, which will make for a better solder connection. As a general rule of thumb, whenever possible, if the copper of the conductor can touch the solder tab, that is a better connection. You don't want the connection to be made solely by the solder itself. Now I'm just getting the flux on each individual tab, 1 drop of solder, holding it for 2 seconds and removing it. Don't dab and tap your solder while you're trying to solder connections. Do it confidently, hold it for 2 seconds, and confidently pull them away. Now you can see the ground wire there, or the shield, has a little bit of extra, a little bit more than we need. So I'm just going to trim it away. We'll then put a little bit of flux in place. We've already tinned the solder tab itself right at the beginning. And so now we're going to use that solder and a little bit of extra, just a little dab of solder, remelt the solder without melting the ground or without tinning the ground, and drop the ground in place into that pool of melted solder. That makes for a great connection. Giving you all my secrets here. And then you just want to use some pliers after this to get the strain relief, just giving a bit of compression on that cable. The next rule we are going to talk about is probably the most important and the most easy to forget, and that is the shell. Never ever forget to put a shell in place. I put the shells right in front of me so they're harder to miss, but inevitably I still miss them from time to time and have to undo all the work I just did to get the shell on. Learn from my mistakes, always remember the shell. If you're doing a plug on the other end of this TRS cable, put that shell on now as well, as you won't be able to get it on if you forget. So both shells go on if you have them. one shell in this instance for this cable because the square plug doesn't have a shell that needs to go on at this stage. And now we are going to prep the square plug side of our TRS cable. Square plugs are one of the smaller, most low profile plugs available at the moment. And we are just going to measure that, score it, and use our wire strippers to take off that jacket. Again, we want to line up that red cable with the ring and put our ground in the appropriate spot in relation to that. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to pull the ground over to the right-hand side. Maybe it's the left. Let's see what happens. The right-hand side, there we go. And the ring is red, the white is tip. And again, my big awkward hands are getting in the way. I just trimmed the ring cable to the appropriate length in relation to that tip length as well. So that's why I was lining it up with the cable to see where the tip needed to be soldered to and then trim the ring appropriately. And same deal, I'm just scoring it with the knife, bending it a little bit if I need to, twisting it together to make sure I don't miss any little strands of cable, and then the ring will be the same thing as well. I'll just score it with the knife, bend it a little bit, get my fingernail in there and twist and give it a little bit of a pull. And again, making sure I don't miss any of those strands on the ring connection. Now we can line these up with the solder tips, or the solder tabs, sorry, and we will at that point put a little bit of flux in place as well, which just helps with easier connections. The one thing you want to be careful with pancake plugs as well, on goes the flux, is you can thread the conductors through the hole on the pancake plug if you like. You don't want them to go all the way through and touch the shell of the pancake or square plug. So just give a quick look once you're done soldering and make sure it hasn't gone too far through that hole and is shorting to the shell of the plug. This is even more exaggerated with shells that are not powder coated. So now with my hands in the way, the cables are threaded through the solder tabs, dab of flux, dab of solder, confidently holding them in place for 2 seconds, and then removing the iron. And I'm doing this across all 3 connections, tip, ring, and sleeve or ground. And just giving a little trim of excess ground. You can do this on the other connections as well if they're going through a little bit too far. And you can see some clean connections. Nothing that you can get your fingernail under and pull up. You can give them a little bit of a yank as well to see if there is a good connection in place. And now we are going to put the shell on. Always test your cables with shells on. Sometimes these shells can cause a short, either due to strain relief or the shell actually shorting to some other part in the cable that wasn't quite done correctly. The ground can obviously touch the shell. That's not a big deal because it's already connected by default, but nothing else should be touching. So that square plug is now done. The screws are in nice and tight so they won't fall out later. And the short body straight is also done. And that is a TRS cable with a short body straight and a square plug. Now we actually need to test it. We're going to use a multimeter on the continuity setting. That basically means when the probes are touching, they will make a beep. So as you can imagine, with certain connections, you want a beep, and let's say the tip to the sleeve, if you're testing that, you do not want a beep. So since you just made the cable, you have a better understanding of what should be connected. Sleeve should be connected to sleeve, ring to ring, and tip to tip. There should be no other combination of connections happening. Once your cable's working, your TRS cable is complete.